after dinner talk panel tonight is titled Hedging Your Bets, Where Now for Climate Philanthropy. We have Matt Nisbet with us today, who many of you know published, I think, a quite interesting study of U.S. climate philanthropy spending over the last 5 years, and argues that it's been extremely narrowly spent. We're going to have a panel up, including Matt, to discuss that. Jane Flegal from the Spitzer Trust, Reed Detchen, who has been in and around climate philanthropy, well, longer than I have, which is a long time. And please welcome Mark Gunther, who will be moderating and leading the discussion. So come on up, guys. I'm really excited.
I thought it would be useful, and I've asked Matt to briefly summarize what he learned when he did what is probably the most definitive study that has been done of where climate philanthropy has come from. So Matt.
Sure. The study that I published over the summer, I started from the premise wanting to understand, in the years after cap and trade in 2011, how did the major trend-sending climate philanthropy foundations, how did they respond to criticism in the aftermath of the failure of cap and trade? So in the report, I try to integrate together what the various schools of thought were in terms of where philanthropy needed to go. And then I put together a database of 2,500 grants between 2011 and 2015 from the 19 most influential climate funders historically. There were some missing because they didn't have available public data. And from those 2,500 grants, there was 556 million distributed between 2011 and 2015. What was interesting was that the foundations were true to their longstanding commitment to renewable energy and energy efficiency, in that about $1 out of every $4 invested in NGO groups was to work on behalf of promoting renewable energy and efficiency. And by the way, 20 organizations received more than half the funding. So out of 2,500 grants, 560 million, 20 organizations received more than half the funding. Another 27% of funding went to, which was a new investment, a new emphasis, went to public education and public mobilization. This was not only on behalf of climate change, but specific to renewable energy and in opposition to the oil and gas industry. And then one of the other key findings that got a lot of attention was that less than 2% of all funding went to other low carbon energy technologies. And of that 2%, most of that money went to making natural gas more efficient and cleaner. A little bit of money went to carbon capture and storage, a very tiny amount to the role of government in seeding innovations. And not a single grant out of 2,500 grants was devoted to evaluating nuclear energy or keeping nuclear power plants open or thinking about the future, the regulatory framework for advanced nuclear energy.
Jane, you're the newcomer to this world. Why don't you tell us about the Spitzer Charitable Trust and what your role is as head of its climate program?
Sure, thank you. So the Spitzer Trust is a new entrant to this world, and I think at a relatively auspicious moment. So it seems to us that there are some cracks in the denialism around climate on both sides of the equation. And as far as the climate advocacy community is concerned, I think that despite a lot of growth in renewables and some important progress, it's increasingly clear that we are just nowhere near where we need to be as a society in terms of the effective management of climate risk. Period. Like the climate math just makes that quite clear. And in the face of that, and in the face of climate as a problem, which is wicked and complex and full of uncertainty, the view that we take at the Spitzer Trust is that we really need to diversify the set of zero carbon energy technology options that we have to address the risks of climate change. And what that's meant in practice is that we're focused on supporting innovation across a range of zero carbon technologies. We're relatively agnostic about technology choice, but focusing on some of the stuff that's fallen behind and that we're likely to need to achieve our goals. I would also say that sort of widening the aperture on the solution set on climate, which is a big piece of what we do, should and does for us go beyond looking beyond the power sector for sure, but also looking outside of just mitigation to think about the management of climate risk more holistically, including looking at committed climate risk through things like adaptation and resilience and potentially geoengineering.
And Jane, how big is your climate program? How much money are you giving away?
So we are at the moment giving away, I'm gonna get a lot of phone calls after this. We're at the moment giving away around $10 million a year on climate.
Okay. So I'm here because I've written a couple of long pieces. I'm a reporter who covers philanthropy, which essentially argued that climate philanthropy has failed. If you're going to measure philanthropy, you measure it by its outcomes, and things are clearly getting worse and not getting better. And from both Matt's work and mine, I would say, as we look forward, there are two strong critiques of existing climate philanthropy. One is that the money has flown to the usual suspects, not enough has gone to building a grassroots movement, that the climate movement needs to broaden and ally itself with the labor movement and people of color and indigenous peoples. It's too inside the beltway, this whole idea of climate justice. It's kind of a left critique of climate philanthropy as too technocratic, too inside of the beltway, and not political enough in the sense of winning elections. A second critique, which is probably from the more conservative side, would say we need to depoliticize the conversation about climate. We need to get off this 100% renewables religion that seems to be part of the other group. We need to support all kinds of low carbon technologies, including nuclear, and we need to find ways to bring moderates and Republicans into the climate solutions world, because no major piece of environmental legislation has ever passed without a bipartisan majority in the United States. So Reed, I'm going to make you for a moment the czar of climate philanthropy. I think 30 foundations recently announced they're going to commit $4 billion to climate philanthropy over the next 5 years. Can these two critiques be reconciled? Can you build a big tent big enough to include, Hank Paulson at one end and Bill McKibben at the other? Where do you want to spend that money? What's gone wrong and how should we fix it? And then I'm going to give Matt and Jane a chance to give their ideas too.
Well, Mark, Ted introduced me as the old white guy on the panel who's seen it all and done it all. And most of that has been wrong, as you've indicated. I think that we have been guilty probably of groupthink throughout the process. But I think Rafe Pomerance is here somewhere. Rafe goes back to the 80s and got featured in the New York Times this summer because of that. I think that the tough thing about climate is that the urgency of it. Anybody who gets involved in this issue feels you want to solve it tomorrow because every day it's getting worse. And so people have tried to shortcut the answers. And so it was interesting to hear Matt talk about renewable energy, because that was a second or third stage. The first stage was scare everybody to death and try to regulate it. The second stage was, energy has something to do with it. Let's go where it's popular with clean renewable energy. And the third stage now, I would say, is kind of your social justice. Let's cast a wide net to do this. I think that what was recognized by the failure rate was that in a democracy, there are no shortcuts. You have to build public support. So one thing I was never particularly interested in, for example, was education. And Matt, you mentioned that there's more going on in public education. Ultimately, I think that's what's winning the day as the generational change starts to occur with people who have been exposed to this and understand the risk, and that's going to change the political calculus. To be a little bit more responsive to your question.
I was going to say specific, yeah.
I think the other thing we've learned is that scaring people to death works for a limited number of people. And that there is an opportunity on the optimism side, which we have not yet begun to tap entirely. To a certain extent, renewable energy goes there because it's always been popular. But what I see, and this kind of a gathering is a perfect example when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, when we're talking about energy solutions, I see a future that is going to be, as I think somebody said today, not just better than it would have been, but better than where we are today. And I think that's something people don't recognize. They see climate as a threat, as something that you have to absorb pain and suffering to avoid. And I think that there is a positive story about induced innovation through carbon pricing, that if we told it in the right way, people could see a transition to a better future and be much more positive about it. So to your point about philanthropy, I think some of the people who are trying to reach conservative audiences have done a very good job over the past couple of years of investing in that conversation, mostly in Washington, but really nationally, particularly around carbon taxes, about how economic tools can be used to change the playing field. And I think that more investment in a broader spectrum of views, in my view, I'm on the second half of your question. I would think that we do need to have both sides of the aisle supporting a solution, and we can get there if we figure out better ways to talk about it. So my one instant solution, which I think I may have shared, we need more billionaires on the right to be investing in candidates on the basis of their climate views and be the Sheldon Adelson of climate. $10 million to anybody who wants to talk about climate and run for president. I think that'd be a good program right there.
Matt, what do you think? I mean,
Well,
if you could prescribe a new direction for climate philanthropy, what would it look like?
I think one, it starts with foundations and funders who are willing to invest in new narratives about the problem. One of the things that I go into in the paper, I've written other papers, is this idea of narrative capture on the part of philanthropy and environmental NGOs. We're still telling basically stories about climate change that are several decades old. One starting in the 1970s with limits to growth, that climate change is a problem with capitalism, and only by upending capitalism through grassroots mobilization. This is the Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein social justice narrative. Can we possibly start to deal with the problem? And the other narrative is that climate change is the ultimate market failure. Only by pricing carbon that will cast a wave across the economy and set in motion investment in renewables. That's how we solve the problem. And so we need really new narratives about the issue that becomes sort of the mental frameworks by which informally NGOs and funders and political leaders start to coordinate their action around new directions. And part of that is this idea of spreading risk around or hedging bets. If you were making bets on climate change, why would you invest $1 out of every $4 in the maverick view that scientifically that 100% renewables is capable of solving the problem, and disregard all the good consensus work on decarbonization that other low carbon energy technologies are needed? You would certainly want to try to hedge your bets, even if you are a firm believer in renewables as part of the answer. And the final piece is we don't really have a good model of social change when it comes to the role that general public opinion or social movements would play in actually enacting federal policy. So through 2015, if you add it, or actually through this year, if you add in Tom Steyer's spending, the foundations I looked at plus Tom Steyer spent at least $750 million on public education and mobilization, either in elections or against the fossil fuel industry or on behalf of climate and renewable energy. And the polls show that even on the center right among independents, there's broad support for climate solutions like renewables and other things. But climate change, as you know, doesn't poll as a top of mind voting criteria. Even if it did, the social change theory seems to be that Democrats wouldn't control both of the House and the Senate and of the White House, and therefore they're able to push through some type of really aggressive climate agenda. But we were talking about it over lunch since 1992. What has it been, 4 years since 1992 when Democrats have held both control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, which I think I calculated was 15% of political time since 1992, since I was in high school. So at some point, you have to be able to work on investing in center-right groups and new groups, a whole new type of sort of parallel movement that's able to not only have a realistic technology agenda that moves past talking about climate science and starts focusing on solutions, but that can actually gain votes from Republicans. And in the breakout session I was on advanced nuclear, it was remarked that really in the Senate, in the US Senate, there's only really 5 votes against nuclear, for example. And there's some good examples on advanced nuclear regulatory framework and on tax credits for carbon capture, where you can see the center, the right and the left voting for the same thing, but for different reasons. And I think that's the direction we need to move in, and philanthropy certainly has to play a role. And the final piece of that would be when I pointed out in the study that there was no funding whatsoever for nuclear, some of the pushback that I heard on social media and elsewhere was, well, why does philanthropy need to invest in nuclear? There's a Nuclear Energy Institute, as if NEI was like big oil, right? And there was sort of an absence of a mental model for what role philanthropy could play in the development of an emerging technology like advanced nuclear or in keeping existing nuclear power plants open. And I think there needs to be more articulation on what role philanthropy can play relative to nuclear and things like carbon capture.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing? Because I sort of resent the oppositional framing of movement building as the same thing as keep it in the ground versus technocracy. Because I think in the view of the trust anyhow, I mean, the recognition that social and political and cultural institutions are really sticky and hard to move, and therefore viewing technology as a high leverage point of intervention is not synonymous with a technocratic view of the world. In fact, you could argue that it's a view of the world that takes quite seriously society, politics, and culture. So I think we need to be careful about limiting the creativity around movement building in different kinds of ways by thinking of it narrowly as one particular thing.
Right. I mean, point well taken. So I don't have to ask you, what would you do if you could fund climate action?
Yeah.
So I will ask you to be as specific as you can about what you are doing, who some of the groups you're supporting, and why.
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, the fundamental premise of our work is that you need to diversify the portfolio of options you have in light of the uncertainty. And what that means in practice is a lot of work on just federal energy innovation advocacy in the US. And it also means supporting some more targeted technology-specific initiatives around the things that are, as I said, sort of fallen behind, which would include advanced nuclear, but also carbon capture broadly defined. And we're funding groups. We're funding the Breakthrough Institute, just to be fully transparent. But we're funding the energy innovation work and the deep decarbonization work at the Bipartisan Policy Center in DC. We're funding Clean Air Task Force. We're funding Energy Options Network, ITIF. We're funding Third Way, who's in the room. Some modeling at WR. I mean, is this useful for me to list?
Yes, very useful.
I mean, so one thing I will say is that much has been made of Matt's study in terms of the sort of perhaps ideological narrowness. Whether you take that seriously or not is one question. But as someone who's new to philanthropy, Ted and Rachel Prisker made this point in a piece, which I think often gets lost, which is when you have a lot of money in philanthropy that you need to spend, it is a lot of work to find new and interesting groups who don't have super robust development offices and aren't knocking at your door every day and don't have the capacity and have the capacity to absorb very sizable grants. So there's a dimension of this that's kind of structural around the nature of philanthropy and that isn't just about, oh, climate philanthropy is super narrow in its view. But we're doing our best to try to build a field of organizations who are taking the risk of climate seriously and supporting an approach that is sort of a full portfolio approach to reducing emissions as quickly as possible.
But correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds very Washington-centric and policy-centric.
At the moment, it's very federal policy focused.
So you're not arguing, you don't believe, at least in terms of revealed preference, that what we really need is a mass political climate movement.
I don't think that's the niche that the Spitzer Trust is well positioned to address. I think in the same way that many of us would argue that you need to diversify the portfolio of technology options for energy, I actually don't think there's anything wrong with a diversified approach in philanthropy. So I don't think it's necessary that everyone in philanthropy move in lockstep on their approach to addressing this problem. So for us, I think the focus is much more focused on federal policy advocacy and again, sort of like building the intellectual capital around a different way of thinking about climate, which isn't actually just about policy. It's about sort of discourse and narrative.
Okay. What do you think of that, Matt?
Well, I agree that movement building, there's different types of ways to think about movement. One type of movement is an ideas-based social movement. That you create new ideas and new narratives and new networks of people that are formally and informally coordinating their actions around a specific type of problem framing and solution set. And I think the Breakthrough Institute, along with a network of affiliated groups, have been very successful in doing that, groups like Third Way and others. And so I think that's one way to move forward. And I do believe that at this point, you have the public opinion conditions for political action. And again, it's completely unclear what role general public opinion plays in legislative action today, considering the strong support for things like gun control, for example. Robert Brule, a sociologist, came out with a study that showed that the renewable energy industry and environmental NGOs are outspent on lobbying by other industry sectors 10 to 1. Now, there's things you can definitely debate around the interpretation of his findings and the methodology, but if you just accept that at face value, the implication of that study, there are two implications. One is you can say, well, we need to build a movement capable enough of overcoming this 10 to 1 lobbying disadvantage, where we completely change lobbying rules and we change the nature of Washington, D.C. Or the other implication is, if you're going to get any bill through Congress, given the disadvantage in lobbying, well, you're going to have to work a deal with industry. Just like the tobacco control bill of 2009, its biggest supporter from a lobbying standpoint was Philip Morris, because the bill favored them moving into smokeless tobacco products. Now, I would say that tobacco and climate are not good parallels, even though the climate action movement wants to make it so. But the lesson of that movement is, at the end of the day, despite all the grassroots organizing and the legal victories, it came down to compromising with industry to get any type of legislation done. There's a lot of other compromise. There was pragmatists that led through on the bill rather than the grassroots activists.
So Reed, if you favor the broader bipartisan approach, if you had a marginal dollar to spend, you would give it to who or what kinds of groups?
Well, to that specific question, Mark, I think that there's been some, Larry Linden and some other people have been investing in dialogue on the right to advance market solutions to climate change. And I think that we need to get to a point, I don't think that we're going to get the majority of Republicans to support action on climate. So clearly there has to be some Democratic control of Congress or close to it. But to your earlier point, it's not going to be successful if it's a 50+1 vote. It's got to be broader than that. And so we have to open the door to solutions that Republicans, some thoughtful Republicans, can embrace so that the country can go forward. So I think investing in that is an important, relatively underweighted estimate right now.
Can a climate movement that's opposed to nuclear power ever win over Republicans?
I think the climate movement is broader than any one thing. I thought Jane said it just right, which is we need to be diversified funders and we need to be diversified about the movement. I think that the one thing I've learned over time is humility, that there isn't just one answer. You can't just do a rifle shot approach in Washington. You have to build a grassroots support base so that congressmen are hearing it from their constituents. That's the most essential thing that has to happen. And that's education. It's a variety of things. But we have to be a little bit more, I guess I would say, tolerant of different funding strategies and say, you know what, we need it all. We need to do this, this, and this, because any one of them is not going to be sufficient. What are we trying to do here? We are fundamentally trying to remake the global economy in the next 35 years. This is not a trivial matter. Right. You know, you don't do it with a narrow vote in Congress. You have to persuade people that this is the future that they want and that they want to support politicians who are asking for it. I think we're pretty far along that way on the Democratic side. We need to have some Republicans catch up.
But I think it also depends on how one defines what climate action is, right? Because pretty sort of, I mean, incremental always sounds derogatory, but incremental steps that make clean energy cheap and scalable, that to me is climate action. Is it an economy-wide optimized carbon tax? No. But I think like there needs to be, I mean, one could be more granular in their approach for evaluating what it means to get, and the politics around those two things look very differently.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I think there's one major double-edged sword from, it looks like philanthropy is going to invest a lot more money into public education, grassroots mobilization, and social justice organizing. And that can be important. And one of my critiques in the past has been that funding hasn't looked enough at questions of equity and things like public health and things like resilience, which most affect low-income populations, especially in urban areas. But the double-edged sword, and if you look at how this is playing out politically, is that you have groups like 350.org, Sierra Club, League of Conservation Voters, which is now on the list for the Center for Public Integrity of dark money groups because they're receiving so much untraceable money into their campaigns, that they're creating these litmus tests for Democratic candidates where they have to pledge to 100% renewables, to the closure of nuclear power plants, and to moratoriums or bans on natural gas fracking. And so if you have a movement within, and this is going to be a big debate in the 2020 primaries for the Democratic candidates. It was Clinton versus Bernie, and it's going to be on display in the primary races. If you have a Democratic platform and movement towards really sort of the left wing of the environmental movement's agenda, you make then compromise that much more difficult in Congress, but you also have an agenda that's completely out of line with where expert opinion might be in terms of the energy technologies that are needed. And so I do see that as problematic. And the last piece I would say is that we really need also really strong philanthropic support for journalism. We tend to overlook journalism. When we think about public education or communication, we overlook independent journalism as essential. The type of journalism that Andrew Revkin has done for decades that kind of questions assumptions about climate science and has a critical perspective on that widens the conversation about energy technology approaches and policy rather than narrows them around 100% renewables. And then actually engages in some type of, be able to lead dialogue through various types of forums. So we need to think about what role investigative journalism, explanatory journalism, and critical journalism plays in informing, providing information to elite decision makers, but also holding all parties accountable, just not the fossil fuel industry and conservatives.
I would just add to that storytelling. I think that we don't do a good enough job of creating a narrative that people can integrate and lead them forward.
So I think what you're saying, Matt, is the sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom approach doesn't make sense if you're going to be supporting a set of ideas and policies and advocacy that essentially is going to make it very hard to build a broad-based movement.
Well, I'd say that when the reporter at Critical Philanthropy called me up and said that this is on an embargo and the foundations are going to invest $4 billion over the next 5 years, I said to myself, great, but how are they going to do that? Right? The only way they can do that is just following the patterns that they've always followed. There's no way to move that money in 5 years and not do anything different. So they're not going to do let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? They're going to probably continue to do the same things they've been doing, and the only thing they can start to do is start to hedge their bets a little bit, and there's going to be the pie is going to grow bigger, but I think the emphasis on public mobilization, grassroots activism, social justice is definitely going to grow. And the question is, how much of the money, more of the money, goes to center-right groups or groups working on other low-carbon energy technologies, or center-left groups that are operating within a different type of ideas framework and narrative. And then among smaller funders like Spitzer, how can they see what this pattern is and say, okay, we can play with our money a counterbalancing role or a complementary role by funding in an area that's overlooked, and that's probably where they can make the biggest impact.
Okay.
I do want to raise, can I just raise one issue that I think about a lot? Much has been said about funding conservative outreach on climate, and I'm just curious, I mean, it's a shame that there's not a Q&A portion of this, but I'm not sure that it would help to have a bunch of quite progressive and liberal climate funders be dumping money into conservative outreach on climate. Does that not just undermine the credibility of those organizations when it comes to, I don't know, it's not straightforward to me that is a wise approach either. So I think one has to think about this.
Is Hewlett a progressive liberal? They're sort of
I would suggest, there are conservative people in this room who might have a view of this, but I think that if you're going to talk to quite serious conservative Republicans on the Hill about clean energy innovation or whatever, and the bulk of your budget comes from Hewlett's climate program, if I were a Republican, I would have questions about that.
No, I think that's exactly right, Jane. And I think that's why there needs to be more funding on the right. Mm-hmm. The reason that the funding is all going in a certain direction is because where the funding's coming from. Right. And I think that there should be a constituency on the right for protecting the earth, and that needs to be mobilized and deployed to have conservative approaches to solving the problem.
I think in terms of the Spitzer Trust, I think what folks can do who are solidly progressive funders, and who many of us are, is do what we can to help create the political space for Republicans to step forward and for them to support an agenda on climate, even if it isn't always self-consciously labeled that way, that's constructive and useful in the broader politics. That's how I would think about it. That's how we think about it.
So we're just about out of time. I'm out of questions. We weren't supposed to do this, but there's so much brain power in this room. I would love to just quickly take 1 or 2 Twitter-length questions from the floor. Just stand up, speak loud, and we'll let the panel just respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a
Twitter.
My name is Crap Pomerance. There's an element that might be added to this that what I call a climate impact strategy. Mm-hmm. And the basis of this is that rather than focus only on technology, you build around local, attributable, profound impacts. That becomes a platform for arguing a case. Now, where is this true? I heard the earlier, Florida faces an existential threat. So how, that's where you're going. We're seeing Republican movement on the basis of that. So that's one additional tool.
Ray, if you exceeded your Twitter character limit,
No, it's a good point, though.
I'm here to let you know. I should just say quickly, because I don't think I made this clear, Spitzer is actually funding a bit of work on issues of coastal resilience and adaptation in the U.S., which is related to what you just raised.
Well, I would just say real quick, the pattern is that moderate Republicans or Republicans in Florida, for example, take a more moderate position on climate change, but then they get voted out in the next midterms. And so you're left with no more Republicans as part of the climate caucus. And that's the unfortunate realities of the way that our electoral political system is set up right now.
Well, all right. Let's go there and there. Again, quickly, please.
This is it's actual question and it's quick. So Matt and Reed both mentioned things about narrative and a lot about politics. I'm curious, how much funding goes to things, for example, like young adult novels targeted to conservatives that star a conservative climate change hero? So I'm wondering if we're interested in
No, it's a great.
novelists need money. And if you're talking about news stories, it seems like one place to go would be forms of communicating stories to people that are about to be able to vote. So I can imagine a 17-year-old conservative who reads a story that stars an evangelical Christian who fights for climate change or something like that. So this is just a question. Is that kind of funding happening? What kind of money is going into people whose profession it is to craft narratives?
Matt, do you know?
Well, there was a lot of money that went to EDF and Nature Conservancy to work in the Midwest on outreach to center-right voters, non-traditional constituencies, and they've been doing a lot of good work in that area. There's also a little less money going specifically to target evangelicals. I don't think that the humanities and the cultural storytellers have been mobilized on this, though the left has mobilized them in terms of sort of the street theater that they do and the protest stuff. But in terms of new narratives for young adult novels and things like that, I haven't seen anything like that.
Matt, has money flown to the religious community at all on this issue?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean the evangelical community has received a lot of money. They've been one of the winners in climate philanthropy. But of course, they didn't really. It also comes down to who they vote for in the general election, and they voted in high numbers for Trump. So,
I think I saw one more here, and then we'll wrap up with you, please. Speak up loud, loud, loud.
There's been some discussion in philanthropy about shifting the portfolio towards international funding versus domestic. Do you have thoughts about the appropriate mix between international and domestic climate funding?
Reed, why don't you take that as a UN Foundation guy?
I should be more enthusiastic about it, Judy, than I am. I think that certainly making sure the international process goes forward is a hugely important task. But let's face it, the U.S. is the laggard in this game right now. And for example, if we were to pass a carbon tax tomorrow, I think that China and the EU would instantly line up with that, and we'd have a global price, in an instant, politically speaking. So I don't think that persuading people in other countries is really the best use of U.S. philanthropic money. But I do think the international process is critical.
So I collected all the grants on non-U.S. funding as well. It's considerably more going into non-U.S. funding. It was close to $1 billion for the same period from the same foundations. And most of it went to China, Indonesia, Brazil. Indonesia and Brazil was on deforestation and influencing the supply chain. China was on, mostly through the Energy Foundation, it was on energy efficient buildings and renewables, and then communicating about air pollution. So there's quite a lot of money already going. It was already it was almost 2-to-1 more money going internationally than the U.S.
Matt gave a better answer
super
than I
quick,
did.
because we're out of
I think that kind
time.
of technical assistance helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super quick, because we're going to wrap up.
What percentage of the overall philanthropic spending goes toward research and experiments? And is that enough?
Yeah, almost nothing goes to basic research. It's either research to inform, like policy analysis research, economic research on renewables or calculating, deaths from air pollution. There's almost none on basic energy research or basic scientific research. There's research on the risks of things like natural gas fracking, but almost nothing goes to basic climate science or basic energy science.
I can just say from our perspective, given that we're focused on innovation, you might ask, but I think there's a question of leverage here around the direct funding of research on things like energy in particular. So is the proper role of philanthropy to kind of crowd in public and private spending on energy innovation, or is it for us to directly invest in it ourselves? And I think that is another sort of, that's our view, is that we're better positioned to play a more catalytic role in crowding in the public and private than directly funding ourselves.
Yeah, and there was almost no money going into catalyzing government R&D on energy innovation. There was a lot of money going into private investment in renewables, try to get more private investment in renewables, but nothing on government-driven innovation.
Nothing.
But I'm not. This is before you guys were in the space.
Yeah.
But it was like 500,000, and most of it went to Arizona State University.
All right, I have a light flashing at me here, so that means I have to ask all of you to thank me in joining Reed and Jane and Matt.